though, so that the live stream folks, hi guys, can hear. So this is called Prayer and Uncertainty. This has been a little bit of my pet project for the last 2 years. I've been thinking about this for longer than that, but it is it's been my sabbatical research project. So, and this church, I think, is very influential in how I think about prayer, right? So you all are part of how I have learned about prayer. You guys are the reason why prayer is important to me, because your lives are part of my life as I pray for you all. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about being an associate pastor is that I preach less and I pray more. And I have some colleagues who took their job as an associate pastor kind of in a flippant way, like, oh, I just pop up to pray and that's what I do on Sunday mornings, and the dismissive of the task of praying. And so I feel like that's one approach, right? Like your job could be to pop up and pray, but prayer is never the central thing in worship on Sunday morning. But for me, the more that I was asked to pray on Sunday mornings, the more that I found that I needed to find words to pray, and that I needed to find ways to say what I wanted to say to God on behalf of the congregation, right? Because it's not just my own personal prayer, but it's all of our collective prayers that I'm naming on Sunday morning before God. So the more I took that task seriously, the more I was able to kind of sit in the task of prayer. And I didn't think of it as just popping up to pray. I thought of it as something that was possible to really tend to and to take seriously. And so I started collecting prayer books. I started trying to find out what other people say when they are naming before God what is most important on Sunday mornings in worship. And so I started getting stacks and stacks and stacks of all these prayer books. And so this has been going on for, I was ordained in 2008, so this has been going on for long enough that I've got shelves of books about prayer. And I was always seeking to find the right words to pray. But as Bev Kirk points out, prayer doesn't have to be fancy all the time, right? Prayer can happen anywhere. So on Sunday morning, the task is one thing, but on your regular old Monday morning, your prayer might be just saying the name of the person that you're thinking about and praying for as you're walking down the stairs to get your cup of coffee in the morning. So you might say, Carrie, Carrie, Carrie. You might say, Isaac, Isaac, Isaac. You might just name their name with every step that you take down the stairs. And so for me, there's some tension there, right? There's the Sunday morning task of trying to get it right and to find the most meaningful, expansive language about God and to say what can be said about our deepest longings collectively. And then on Monday morning, you're walking down the stairs and you're saying, Isaac, 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 because you know that he is in need of prayer. And you don't have to name anything about the situation because God holds all of that and God knows all of that. So there's like this wordy piece about prayer, and then there's this settled, unspoken simplicity in prayer. So for me, that's a major gift. And so Bev Kirk calls this a staircase prayer, and I think all of us can resonate with the staircase prayer. Um, and it's a prayer of trust, because we trust that God knows already what it is that we are longing for. Or the situation is so uncertain that there's no words anyway, because you know, we don't know what the paths forward could be, and so we kind of sit in uncertainty. So I've been thinking about prayer because I want to do this right. I want to get prayer right. I want to find the most beautiful language, the most evocative language, the most touching language, and also I want to give all that up. I want to say it's okay to just sit in silence. It's okay to just name the name of the person. So, so the Sunday morning, Monday morning also accentuates the two longings that I have. I have my own personal longing, right? I long to be close to God. And so I want my prayers to be personable, or purposeful. I want them to be as open as possible so that I can be in the presence of God. But I also have a longing as a pastor that each of us, each of you in the congregation, has your own authentic way of connecting with God so that you can be as connected to God as is possible in your daily lives. And that you can trust yourself, right? That you can trust that your prayer to God is right and good and heard and welcomed by God. And, you know, Bill and I know this. We get called on to say the prayer at dinners and family gatherings and all sorts of things because we're the pastor, and so we like know how to do this, right? And people make that nod to pastors to pray for a couple of reasons. One, I think, is because prayer can be intimidating a little bit, because how do you know what to say? And also because I think people take it seriously, right? It's something that matters. It's something that we want to tend to with carefulness and gentleness. And it's momentous enough that we want to take it seriously. So, and I find myself doing that too, right? I buy all these books. I want to get it right. I want to defer to the experts and find the right kind of prayers. So we all are like this. We want to turn to the experts and we want to get it right. But each of us have an opportunity to trust ourselves, to trust our inner connection to the divine, and to name before God what's most important to us on any given day. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like. So these guys, I think they're all in college now, but this is middle school youth group, and I think we were doing some sort of game where they had to get those balloons from one end of the sanctuary to the other without the balloons touching the ground or their feet touching the ground. So they may have been walking on the pews in the sanctuary. And so middle school youth group is grounded in play and then pray. And the playing takes up most of the time. And at the very end, we gather them to pray. And we save like 10 minutes to pray. And during those 10 minutes, most of it's fidgeting and most of it's trying to get them to settle down or asking them what they want to pray about. And by the end of the year, by the end of the school year, you can sense the way that they've grown up into prayer, that they have a sense that they can take themselves seriously, they can trust themselves with who God is, and that their prayers matter to God. And so they will pray for their grandfather who's in the hospital. They'll pray for their mom who's going through chemo. They'll pray for their dad who's on a business trip in a foreign country and they're worried about their dad getting home. They'll pray about the really serious stuff, and you hear about their lives in in this very brief little moment of prayer. And I always feel proud of them at the end of the school year because you can see how far they come. And then school ends and they have all summer and you get them back together in September and the sixth graders are now seventh graders and you have this new group of fifth graders and nobody knows how to do this anymore. They don't trust themselves. They just want to goof off. And so your prayer requests at the beginning in September are going to be, I want to pray for Mark because he can't keep his shoes on, or some sort of fart joke or something like that. Or I want to pray for my fantasy football team because my running back is injured and whatever. And they're like on this kind of surface level prayer, right? They're not able to trust themselves or trust each other with the thing that is vulnerable. And so September, you just feel discouraged. You're like, oh, I love you guys, but can't we just like take ourselves seriously? But they can't because they haven't built that trust with each other yet. And to me, it points to the vulnerability of prayer, that you have to trust yourself, you have to trust the people that you're with, and you have to trust God that the worries and hopes and dreams and fears that you're naming before God matter and that they are safe to say aloud. So prayer is actually, it's something we want to get right and we take seriously, but it's also something that's deeply vulnerable and can influence us in ways that can break our heart and can mend our heart and can ground us and can connect us to one another. So what I want to do, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about my prayer journey from a young age until now. Because I think all of us have a prayer journey. And so hopefully these little mile markers in my own journey can help you hear your own mile markers in your own journey. They're going to be different than mine. They're going to happen at different times in your life. But hopefully this will give you a window into your own story as well. So my very earliest prayer memory was in elementary school. I grew up going to a big Gothic cathedral kind of church in Indianapolis. And in that church, there were gobs of children, and we were, just as rowdy as those fifth and sixth graders at Kenilworth Union. And so we had a children's ministry director. She's kind of like the grandmother of children's ministry, and her name was Lucy Brock. We were allowed to call her Lucy. And she brought us one day, maybe it was, I don't know why we were with her, but we were with her, and she brought us into a Sunday school classroom, and the chairs were in a circle, and in the middle of the room was a candle, and she had us all sit down, and she, by some miracle, got us to be quiet, and she lit the candle, and she may have said something, but all I remember was the candlelight. And she made room for that candlelight to unveil the mystery of the presence of God. There's something about her intentionality about it, about setting the scene and lighting the candle. There's something about being with church friends and about the silence of that space. And it was one of those gentle kind of places. But prayer was brand new to me at that time. I had probably some prayers memorized at that time when I was probably in third grade. But prayer was still, to me, uncertain because it was new. It was new in the way that if you can remember, like learning multiplication when you were in third grade, and the math piece of it's new, even though every time that you've played with your Legos and you stack 3 Legos and you stack 3 more Legos and you stack 3 more Legos, you've got 9 Legos, right? Like the math has been there all along. You just didn't see it the way that your teacher's trying to teach it to you. And so for me, I think Lucy was showing me something that had been there all along, but I just hadn't seen it. She was awakening me to the possibility of the presence of God. So this is Bradley Wigger. He teaches at Louisville Seminary. He teaches Christian education, and I didn't know what he knows. I didn't know what he knew. And so here's what he says. He says, breathing is the beginning of prayer. Beneath every word, he says, the breath of life moves in and out and through us. Prayer is breathing deeply in the Spirit of God. And I'd been breathing my whole life, but I didn't know that prayer was that simple, that prayer was one breath in and one breath out. And so this little encounter with Lucy came and went. And I don't remember anything particular about prayer until seventh grade. And I don't know about you and how you were in 7th grade, but I came to church in 7th grade because there were cute boys. And I wanted to be part of that situation. There were cute boys, and that was my main motivation for going to church. Prayer was just this tangent, right? It was like this thing that was an accessory to being at church. So prayer at that point felt foreign to me again. I had lost track of that thread from Lucy. I kept showing up to church because that's what my family did, but I'd lost track of that little thread where she had lit that candle in our presence. And prayer was just the thing that the adults did when youth group was over, right? When we were like about to be done with youth group. And then there was one day, and it could have been a special kind of, weekend thing, or it could have been just a regular youth group night. But I remember exactly where I was. We were in the gym. We had just been playing some sort of silly game in our church gym. And the crazy adults who commit to hanging out with 7th graders, and that's like a very beloved special person that spends time with 7th graders. They brought us together and had us hold hands, and someone said a prayer. I don't remember what they said, but there was something about that day. Maybe nobody else in that group felt connected to the presence of God on that day, but I did. Something about that prayer made me feel deeply connected to the presence of God. And so prayer was uncertain to me in those days. Prayer was not something I trusted anymore. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust the people I was with. I didn't trust God to trust me to pray. Prayer was just foreign to me again. And I hadn't quite learned what Mark the ascetic, desert monk from the 5th century, knew, which is that there are many different methods of prayer, and no method is harmful, for if it were, it would not be prayer. So I didn't quite trust that I could do this thing called prayer, and I didn't trust maybe the people I was with. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust God to receive my prayers, and I didn't quite know that that it could happen in all these different kinds of ways. So later still in high school, I was the kid who had all the questions. So we would read, we would do a devotional on Sunday morning in high school, Sunday school, or on Wednesday night for youth group or whatever. And I would be the kid who would hear whatever it was we were talking about, and I'd have 45 questions I needed to ask my youth pastor afterwards. And so in the midst of everything that was overwhelming about high school, right? When you're in high school, every mundane thing is huge, right? Every interaction with friends at school, um, every little thing matters. And I was the kid who was in the parking lot after church with my car keys in hand. My youth pastor probably really wanting to go home. And he would listen to one more of my questions. And it was under this canopy of stars, and probably, crisp night sky. And he left space for that to ask those questions. And that happens here too, right? We don't have a parking lot, but we do have the night sky. And those questions arise at night, right? They are questions that come when the stars are out. And so I know that those conversations, those transcendent conversations, are happening. And so that is not prayer necessarily, but my favorite theologian, Catherine Keller, says that theology, or the work of talking about God, is itself akin to prayer. And so when we're trying to figure out how God is at work in the world, when we're talking about God, we are part of a prayerful way of being. And so there's something foggy about the presence of God, right? Cloudy, where you can't quite see all of who God is. And all those questions are kind of trying to see through the fog. And the presence of God can arise in that space when you're trying to see through the cloud and see through the fog of all of that. So those days were uncertain for me, because this is where I started to think that I needed to know everything. So this is Nicholas de Cusa. He's a 15th century theologian. And prayer was uncertain to me then in that time because I didn't quite trust that I didn't need to know everything about God. I thought that if I could ask the right question and get the right answer, that I would have this God stuff figured out. So I was very driven by asking questions because I wanted to know. But Nicholas de Cusa says that God is inaccessible and incomprehensible, unnameable, unmultiplied, and invisible. So I didn't quite yet know that not knowing was okay, and that uncertainty was also a prayerful response to seeking God. So it took me a really long time to give up uncertainty. I think I spent all of my college years trying to ask good questions so that I could really know who God was. And I went to seminary for that reason. And somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure where, I was able to let go of some of that needing to know, right? This is a picture of me in 2008. This is my ordination. That is Ray Bowden. He was a pastor at my home church, and he and I got to serve communion together the first time that I was, serving communion as an ordained pastor. And so this was really special to me. He went to the same college as I did. He went to the same seminary as I did. He had worked at my seminary, and being close to him at the communion table gave me this sense of peace. I had asked him a lot of questions, right? And I God, I I didn't he didn't feel like he needed to always carry an answer to my questions. And that was really important to me. So I think my home church is similar to Kenilworth Union Church in its approach to prayer and uncertainty, that we don't need to always know in order to trust God. Um, so it's that same stairwell right there. This is, right at the top of the chancel steps. That's the same chancel where I was confirmed in 1996, and then I was ordained in 2008. And in the 12 years in between, I did a lot of moving from needing to be certain um, to being a little bit more okay with uncertainty. And so here's the other piece of uncertainty, right? There's our knowing God, and being certain about who God is. But I think there's two pieces to prayer and uncertainty that are important to me, that really I had to kind of start separating a little bit as I was doing my research in prayer and uncertainty. On the one hand, there's our certainty about God and our needing to know about God. And then there's this piece about the uncertainties that come up in our lives, right? And so we face in our lives these moments where we don't know what's going to happen next. And it happens at the micro level in our own personal lives, and it happens at the macro level in our kind of global cultural lives. So I'm going to tell you stories about 2 times when that happened in our global kind of context and how they relate to my story of prayer for me. So the first is New York City on September 11th, and my very first theology class, sophomore year of college, happened to take place on September 11th, 2001 at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. So, it's syllabus day. We get our syllabus. We've got our kind of marching orders for the semester. And after class, I walk out to the mail room where students and staff and teachers are gathered around the television. And I thought it was a movie. I thought it was some action film, right? There was nothing in me that could have thought that this was fact and not fiction. And all of us know the ways that the new reality of that day came crashing down around all of us. It brought uncertainty and shadow and cloud and this kind of incomprehensibility, right? We didn't know what was going to happen next, and there was something about that day that was just unbelievable enough that it felt like it brought uncertainty in a new kind of way. So for me, thinking back on that, I never really had put it together quite as intensely as I have in the last couple of years, that when I studied theology for the first time as a student, I was reading it through the lens of that event, right? So the books, I am guessing that the syllabus remained the same, right? But the punctuation was very different. So we read a book on God, suffering, and evil that held all of my why questions. We read a book on interfaith relationships that held all of my questions about that sudden and intense Islamophobia that came about right after 9/11. And we read the ancient theologians and current theologians Augustus, Aquinas, Calvin, Sally McFaig, people who themselves had lived through times of uncertainty, culturally and in their own personal lives, and their voices gave me a place to be in conversation with God. Um, so something about uncertainty and my sense of who God is in the world have been always kind of interwoven, I think, in a way that I didn't quite know. So then jump ahead 19 years, and we hit another moment of national and global distress. And the world shuts down, right? March 2020. I found myself instinctively turning to theology. And now, just thinking back on it, I think it's because of my, relationship to theology at the time of national disruption in the past on 9/11 that really drove me to read theologians in that moment. And so suddenly we couldn't be together, right? In the hours and days after 9/11, that's all we did. We got together, right? We found our friends. We found our people. We gathered at church. We gathered as community. But in March of 2020, that was the only thing that we couldn't do, right? We couldn't be together. And so Bill and Joe and Christine and I came here to this eerie place where the lights are off everywhere because nobody's coming in. And we're standing in the mystery of an empty sanctuary, and nobody's ever done this before. And we're offering prayers to a vitally empty sanctuary and to a vividly virtual church. We couldn't go see people in the hospital. It was dutiful to stay away, right? It was our job to stay away. We couldn't gather young people to hear about their vulnerable worries and fears. There were no parking lot conversations at that time. We only saw them on the screen in the cocoon of their own living rooms. And so suddenly all our prayer requests were the same, right? No matter what group I gathered with on Zoom, our prayer requests were the same every time. If it was a group of parents, if it was a group of kids, if it was a group of church leaders, if it was a group of just our senior staff, the prayers, it's like we had decided on the same litany. It's like we'd been assigned this prayer. We prayed for the nurses. We prayed for the essential workers. We prayed for the hospitals. We prayed for the people who had COVID. We prayed for the people who were barely able to say goodbye over FaceTime. And we prayed for the ones who were exposed. And all the prayers were urgent. And none of the 5th and 6th graders would dare goof off in those early March days, right? They were able to bring their vulnerable selves to God in that space. And uncertainty looked different in every family. In every situation. But there was grief, and there was grief deferred, and everything changed, right? So I spent a lot of time praying that prayer, right, for the nurses, for the essential workers, for the ones who have COVID, for the ones who have died, for the ones who are lonely. That same prayer over and over and over again. And so, in the summer of 2020, I was supposed to go on sabbatical, and I postponed because I had this thought that I was going to miss the reopening of the church. The world was going to reopen in the summer of 2020, and I was going to miss it, and I didn't want to miss it. And clearly that didn't happen, right? We still had a long way to go. So because I postponed my sabbatical, I was able to apply for this Louisville Seminary, Louisville Institute grant And I told them I wanted to study prayer and uncertainty. Louisville Institute likes to plug. They want us to let you know that they were in charge of this. So, they did. They gave me generous funding to study prayer and uncertainty, and I have an entire bookshelf of books to prove it. And my sabbatical began on January 1, 2021. And, for example, I watched the events of the Capitol on January 6th, surrounded by books about prayer. And I helped my parents and my in-laws make their first COVID vaccine appointments while tucking into theologians who were trying to offer hope amid uncertainty. And the first book I read, cover to cover, was this one. I don't know if you know her, Kate Bowler. She wrote this book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Love. And in 2015, Kate Bowler herself entered a season of uncertainty. She was an untenured professor at Duke Divinity School. She was at the beginning of her career as a public theologian. She had a toddler at home and a promising career ahead of her, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And so in the swirl of emotions after that diagnosis, this is the prayer that she says she prayed. She said, God, remember my son. God, remember my husband. God, do not turn me to ashes. And she asked all those same hard questions that all of us ask when we're facing real uncertainty. She says, why? She says, God, are you there? Right? This is the question that we ask when we're facing uncertainty. And she asked, what does this suffering mean? And she noticed in herself, she'd been studying prosperity gospel. She'd been studying the megachurch preachers who preach that everything is going to be okay if you just give everything up to God, right? That it's all going to turn out all right. Everything happens for a reason. And instinctively, she felt herself longing for that kind of certainty. She wanted to live in that space where everything happens for a reason. And she was trying to grasp at control. And so her book outlines her journey from first toward all of that theology that says everything happens for a reason, and then away from it and trying to figure out how to navigate, knowing that sometimes we're not in control. But she says that it's exhausting to not know, that uncertainty is exhausting. So she was squinting through tears in an unbearable future in which her son and husband might be left to face the future alone. And she could not remake the world by the sheer force of love. She says, control is a drug and we are all hooked. We want to tell ourselves a story, any story, so that we can get back to certainty. Or as another theologian puts it, when life turns upside down, we realize that certainty is a facade, a falsehood, but even still, losing the certainty that never existed in the first place is devastating. So we want to tell ourselves a story so we can get back to certainty. And then this is John Gill. He's a theologian in California. He says that searching for certainty is as futile as grasping the wind with hologram hands. So Kate Bowler quickly oriented all of my understanding of prayer and uncertainty. If we are hooked on control, and if John Gill is right, that certainty is as futile as grasping at the wind with hologram hands, then my experience of uncertainty in the wake of 9/11 and in the midst of those early days of COVID and the pandemic were actually a grounding in reality. What we do not know what tomorrow will bring. We cannot guarantee or control the future. We cannot force God's hand toward the outcome we want. And I always wondered why I loved this passage, but now I kind of get it. We can only rest on those famous words from Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. So we can't control the future. Today has enough for today. And Kate Bowler says she learned that really quickly in the midst of the chaos of her treatment and surgeries and trying to recover. She said, I am stuck in the present tense with a scan around every corner, and I have lost the ability to make extended plans, to reach into the future and speak its language. The year ahead is floating away, too far to see, and I must keep myself sewn into the present moment with pills and needles and white blood counts. So maybe prayer in uncertainty is about facing our mortality and living in the now, two things that we really don't love doing. But our spiritual practices, nonetheless. This book is not a book about prayer. This is called The Song of the Trees. And so this is by a biologist. And he says, instability unsettles us. Fallen monuments and crumbling homes and leveled forests are a site of pathos. But places that suggest permanence and durability, 1,000-year-old temples, or the ancient redwood tree lift our spirit. So even now, we're still in this moment where people are coming back to church, right? Some people are just this month coming back to church for the first time since March of 2020. They haven't been in the sanctuary since then. But it's no wonder that stepping into the sanctuary of Kenilworth Union Church or standing under the cloisters gives us a sense of awe or hope or rest. It looks like the kind of place that's been here for centuries or millennia, right? The architecture and the stone. Time can be forgotten here under the archways of the cloisters, or in that soft light that comes into the sanctuary in the middle of the day. Our mortality is less fearful in the sanctuary because our mortality is mingled with the saints of light who have gone before us, and we can trust in the rhythms of life and death with God's presence baptizing all of it. It's that much easier to live in the now in a place like this and feel the resonance, the sound of the Spirit of God thundering through your body. Contemplative scholar Barbara Holmes, she writes that the worldly resistance to transcendence that we wear into the sanctuary cracks open, and the contemplative moment carries us toward the very source of our being. So entering the sanctuary can help us to give up the shell that keeps us from being vulnerable with God. So how do we pray? How do we pray then? We pray by trusting God, right? And we trust that we can center God our understanding of. We can center our understanding of God. So if we think God is far off, then when we pray, we have a long way to go, right? When we pray. But this German mystic Meister Eckhart says, God is nearer to me than I am to myself. So if we live in that space, that God is nearer to me than I am to myself, it's a good starting place. God is present. God is here. We don't have that long way to go, right? We don't have to pray all the way to Pluto or whatever. And yet, sometimes these big, majestic places can fill us up in a particular way. At the end of a mission trip when I was in high school, we were working in Seattle and um, we spent time with the homeless population and with children of women who were living on the edge and who were homeless, um, and then on our free day we took a bus to Mount Rainier, and so I carried kind of the weight of that week with me to Mount Rainier. And I sat with one of my friends and we sang this psalm. I don't know if you've ever, there's 100 different versions of it, but the one that I learned as a kid was, I lift my eyes up to the mountains, where does my help come from? You know this one? My help comes from you, maker of heaven. So there's some certainty there, right? It starts with uncertainty. Where does my help come from? And then it comes back to that deep peace of the presence of God with us. So we can trust that God is with us, right? We can have a little bit of certainty that God is with us in all of this. It is possible to know and to see God. But that's not true for everyone. Not everyone can live in that space where they are certain about the presence of God. So Scripture holds all of this in tension. One of the key components of prayer in uncertainty for me is to acknowledge that we can't conjure or force or control God, right? We can't say, God, I want to feel your presence, and then it happens, right? And so Moses has this complex relationship with God, and God says to Moses, "No, you can't see my face. You can't see my face. No one can do this and live." In the Gospel of John, when we're introduced to who Jesus Christ is, we're told no one has ever seen God. And then the book of John goes on to say that we see God in Jesus Christ. And we are forever after searching for the face of God in the face of Jesus. And then in the book of Corinthians, and I quoted this yesterday in my sermon, we see mysteriously through a mirror in this time, but then we will see face to face. So for Paul, and that's in the middle of this passage that we read at weddings, right? You've heard it read at 100 weddings. God is, that love is kind, and love does not boast, and everything that Paul knows about love, he stuffs into this passage, and then it gets kind of intermingled with this stuff about the impossibility of knowing God, which I kind of love. And then Moses, still in this complicated relationship with God, finally gets to the top of the mountain, and God says to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud." So it's still foggy, right? Like we can't quite completely see. We can't control or domesticate God, which gives us this picture that God is as close to ourselves as we are, and yet God is beyond us, right? God is unbounded. God is within us and close by, but also beyond our power. So one last little story, and then I quit. This is a picture of me when I was a kid. I found this in my baby book a little while ago, and I like it because I'm like nibbling on I'm pretty sure that's from church. It's like Jesus, or it's definitely a churchy thing. it's got to be Jesus, right? Look at that tunic. Um, and it reminds me that, because I'm eating that piece of paper, it reminds me that we taste and see the nearness of God. That God is not just about knowing, but that God is beyond our cognition, right? We can't ever get all the answers to our questions and know completely God. God is tangibly present and incarnate within us. And so we're the kind of people who affirm that God is not just with us, people who can know things about God, like, maybe we have some favorite scripture passages. Maybe we know some things about theology. Maybe we have been going to church for enough decades to follow along when we're in worship. We know what to do to worship God. But we also trust that God's with our children, right? And children, especially infants, have no way of having certainty or clarity or knowledge about God. They don't have words to describe God. They don't have words to pray to God. But we trust that precognitively, before we can know that God is with us already. And so that does finally ground my sense of God in uncertainty. That we can trust ourselves, that we can know God in that place that is beyond knowing. So this is my final quote. So this is Nigerian spiritual director Bayo Akumalafe. And he says this. He says, "What if not knowing is our greatest asset yet? What if we could treat the unknown, the unthinkable, the things beyond data as a resource instead of an inconvenience?" He says, "To find a brighter light, we must head for the gloomiest caves. To understand ourselves, we must turn to the strange. To find our way out of trouble, we must embrace trouble with fond reverence. And to thrive and live, we must come to the thinnest places where life and death are not opposites, but bedfellows." So what if not knowing is our greatest asset? May we be people who pray in uncertainty. Thank you. Thank you. So